It's been a rough weekend in the Cape Town region as 10 people were stabbed and gunned down over this past weekend alone. It's suspected that these deadly incidents could be related to gang violence. For more details on the story and other crime-related incidents in the city during the festive season, I'm now joined by Reagen Allen, the Western Cape Community Safety MEC. Mr. Reagen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Now, can you provide an overview of the recent incidents involving the stabbings in the Western Cape?
Katlego, once again, best wishes for you and all the viewers. It does pain us that when we see that there is sporadic gang violence in our communities, when we consider Hanover Park in terms of the gang violence, but also across the entire city. What we have seen is that there has been sporadic gang violence, there has been gang violence between gang members as well, but also as a result of a number of gang members being in prison at the moment, which leaves a vacuum for other would-be criminals to ultimately take a certain role in that particular gang. We have been consistent outside. Our policing needs and priorities have consistently shown that we are needing to ramp up the AGU unit, the anti-gang unit within the South African Police Service, and I've always maintained, Katlego, that we want our oversight to lead to better service delivery, but also ensure that we can curb criminality. We have also done an assessment, Katlego, and that assessment from April up until September, we had 404 gang-related murders. In that 404 gang-related murders, 18.3% or 74 of those murders were a bystander, an innocent victim, or where there was mistaken identity and where the investigation actually concluded that that particular victim had no relation to the gang. And it pains us, it hurts us considering that we are wanting to make sure that the anti-gang strategy must land, it must actually fulfill its purpose to eradicate gang members and criminality off our streets. And if I look at the last month alone, when we hear this news and when we visit communities, it does leave that hole in terms of the fear, the anxiety that many communities are facing.
I mean, this is quite astounding. 404 gang-related deaths in just 6 months. Do you know what's heightened the fights between these gangs, especially during that time?
Katlego, it is twofold. We have seen the inter-gang violence, where one particular gang would have inter-fighting amongst themselves, but also where there is gangs that would want to enlarge their territory. And then there's fighting over drug turf, over certain territories. We are very clear outside that when we look at gangs and when we look at the violence that emanates from gang violence, we are very clear that we must ensure that any person that is part of a gang that is committing crime must ultimately be held accountable. There's another secondary aspect to it. We have seen that over this particular calendar year, 8,000 parolees being released back into our communities. 8,000. Of that 8,000, during a 3-month period, 113 reoffended, and that includes for murder, assault, and attempted murder cases. 113 that ultimately reoffended. So when we talk from the Western Cape government side, we know we have a mandate to ensure that there's oversight over the South African Police Service, and we are asking and we are actually demanding for devolution to take place so that we can have greater control over the South African Police Service. It makes sense, Katlego, because now certain decisions are made all the way in Pretoria. It is 1,500 kilometers away from the Western Cape. We are wanting to ensure that we have that responsibility here. But also if we look at the role that our Department of Correctional Services, also at the national level, plays in being unable to a large extent to rehabilitate offenders. So once those offenders arrive back in a particular area, we also see a flare-up in gang activities. We have also seen a flare-up when there is a number of gang members that is attempted to be recruited into our gangs. Hence, we have launched in 2019 already our Western Cape Safety Plan, which is that whole-of-government approach where we work with schools to ensure that our young people are not on a conveyor belt into gangsterism, but also we have placed lead officers and that is law enforcement officers from the Western Cape government in partnership with the City of Cape Town, which is outside of our mandate, Katlego. We have placed budget aside to ensure that we can have extra boots on the ground. I've maintained we are potentially 20 years behind in terms of the actual amount of resources that we require from the South African Police Service here in our province. And against that backdrop, I'm so amazed when we work with dedicated officers that is often doing the work of 4 or 5 officers within our province. So we maintain the under-resourcing, but also when we look at the units, and I spoke earlier about the anti-gang unit, the anti-gang unit ultimately needs to ensure that all gang activities within a particular area can be curbed. We have seen now one particular case where a high flyer gang member, drug lord, was arrested, and that case took 5 years to ultimately go through the courts to ensure that there's actually a sentence in that particular matter. We would want to see that being fast-paced. And since my appointment, I've had engagements with the DPP's office, with correctional services, with the South African Police Service, and with relevant stakeholders to ensure that we can work collaboratively. But we still see that budget cuts from national is hampering service delivery here in our province as a result of the under-resourcing. But also, when we look at what we need is to ensure that there is a crime intelligence-led approach. And we maintain crime intelligence should ultimately be ramped up. The mandate that of the South African Police Service is ultimately to prevent, to combat, and to investigate crime. That's a huge mandate, and that particular mandate should get the resources that it requires. Another astounding stat, Katlego, is that of all gang-related murders in our country, 85% occur here in the Western Cape. 85%. So when we talk in the Western Cape about wanting devolution, wanting that responsibility, it is not a political call. It's a call that makes sense. It's in the Constitution, 206 of the Constitution, where certain functions can ultimately be allocated to a provincial executive, like here in the Western Cape. And we have had those discussions. The National Minister is not in favor of devolution, but even members within his political party is already calling for a new policing model to take shape, because it's currently all at the national level. Resources are spread from national, where we see our policing needs and priorities not being taken into account.
So Reagen, I mean, you speak of a devolution, and I know that the police minister had been in Philippines in the last couple of weeks over the festive season, campaigning for these festive season campaigns and the strengthening and the heightening of police visibility within these communities in order to fight crime. And yet you say it's not a political issue. What other issue is it then that the national South African police are not able to work with the Western Cape in ensuring that these gang-related violence is curbed, and that 85% of the gang murders are happening in the Western Cape, and yet that attention is not given to the Western Cape?
Katlego, on the contrary, we have seen now that over the last 2 years, I've been very adamant in the mandate that I've received from the Premier. When I was appointed 625 days ago, Katlego, I'm counting because I know we don't have time. So when I was appointed, part of my mandate that the Premier gave me was to ensure that I can foster genuine working relationships with all stakeholders. And here in the Western Cape, we are working solidly with the South African Police Service. And when we look at what we need from the South African Police Service, it is not what we are actually getting, and that flows all the way from national. So even though there is good cooperation between our LEAP officers, between our neighborhood watches here in the Western Cape and the South African Police Service, the South African Police Service in general across our country is severely under-resourced. And the National Commissioner, the previous National Commissioner, is on record to actually state in Parliament that the South African Police Service is unable to fulfill its mandate. So against a government, a national government that is fully aware that they are unable to fulfill their mandate if the resources are not set out accordingly, if the policing needs are not set out accordingly, it generally speaks to skewed allocations. It also speaks to a an economy that is ultimately not growing, so that those resources cannot be attributed. But it's my mission to work with all the stakeholders here in the province, because I don't want to get a free pass. And in the same instance, I don't want to give any other department a free pass, Katlego. We look at the role that each and every department has to play in the criminal justice system. Each and every component is so vital. If the NPA is not doing his work or is not fulfilling the mandate of making sure that cases are prosecuted, it ultimately leaves criminals to become more emboldened. If criminals goes to prison and they serve only 2 years and then they are then released out on parole, it ultimately places further fear within communities. We want ultimately for perpetrators to be held accountable, for our correctional services to ensure that they can fulfill their mandate in rehabilitating offenders, or at least if a defender, if a parolee is not rehabilitated, that person should not be on our streets. He should not have the power, essentially, like we've seen in the Tasney van Wyk, 11-year-old girl who was ultimately brutally killed by a person who was less than 3 months out on parole. That person should never have been out on parole. He should have served his sentence, and quite frankly, he should have been behind prison and behind bars for life already.
Most certainly. So in relation to the 10 deaths that took place over the past weekend, have there been any arrests or progress in identifying those perpetrators?
Katlego, we have received an update from the South African Police Service on our side. There has been no arrest as yet, but I can confirm that a number of persons of interest are being tracked. And as soon as I get information, I will make sure that we send those information to you and to the producer as well, because we maintain in the first 72 hours, it's so vital that once we activate our 72-hour processes by making sure that there's extra deployments in that particular area, but also that potential witnesses are looked for, so that we can bring these perpetrators ultimately to book.
You mentioned earlier on that out of the 404 gang-related deaths, 74% of those who die are just bystanders. How is law enforcement collaborating with community organizations in order to enhance safety and security, especially in those affected areas? I mean, you made mention of Hanover Park a little earlier on.
Katlego, thank you for this question. What we have done here in the Western Cape is to work with the South African Police Service, and we have actually introduced the evidence-based and data-driven approach. What that essentially means, that we have neighborhood watch members that act as the eyes and ears in particular communities, and these are amazing volunteers that are giving up their time. We have over 17,500 within our province that patrol and that work with the South African Police Service and with the CPF. We also then see how the data that we collect on where murders are happening, what time murders are happening, so that we know there could be a proactive approach to ultimately prevent crime. So it is an approach that ultimately has been used widely all over the world, where we see that when our officers are out, what times they are out. We have even changed some of our deployment times so that our officers can be over a weekend, mass and high density over a weekend, because we have seen over a weekend before, from a Friday up until a Monday morning, that's when the most gang-related murders and attempted murders occur. So it is a data-led, evidence-based approach where we have our officers in a particular area at a particular time, because the data shows us that is where crime is most likely to occur. But there is pockets, Katlego, considering that gang members have become so brazen. We have seen some of them are in possession of AK-45 machine weapons ultimately, and it speaks to a broader crime intelligence vacuum that we want to see. And crime intelligence is a national competency. We would want that particular competency to do its work so that these criminals can ultimately be apprehended.
All right, Mr. Allen, thank you so much for your time. We certainly do hope that these criminals will be apprehended sooner than later. That was Reagen Allen, Western Cape's Community Safety MEC, speaking to us there about the 10 deaths that took place just this past weekend alone.